Welcome everyone to today's webinar, 6 Keys to Success in Out-of-Network Reimbursement. I'm Inga Broerman, Vice President of Marketing for CollectRx. Today we'll be hearing from Brian Ellison, one of CollectRx's senior account executives, about how providers can maximize their out-of-network payer reimbursements. We'll begin today's webinar with a presentation, and we'll have time after the presentation for a question and answer session. You can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into the Q&A box you see on your screen. We're looking forward to hearing your questions, and if we don't have time to cover them in today's session, we'll reach out to you afterwards to answer them directly. Today's session is being recorded and will be available after the event. You can click on the same link you used to log into today's webinars to access the recording. At this time, it's my pleasure to start today's webinar by introducing our presenter, Brian Ellison.
Thanks, Inga. So I guess the best place to start with all of this is with the company name, because it is a little bit misleading. We're actually not a patient collections company, and we have nothing to do with pharmaceuticals. What we do is we work with our clients to get higher reimbursements specifically on out-of-network claims. Now, even though the work that we do is all done on a case-by-case basis, the goal here is going to be to increase a provider's revenue in the aggregate. And the way that we go about doing this is through a unique combination of data and analytics with subject matter and legal expertise. And over the years, we've generated literally hundreds of millions of dollars in additional revenue for our clients. And as I'll show you here in a second, one of the best parts about doing business with us is that we have a unique no-risk fee structure where we get paid only if the client does. So turning to the agenda for today, we'll go ahead and kick off the presentation by introducing you to CollectRx, our results, our customers, and our team. We'll then go over the tactics that the payers are currently using to reduce provider revenue, touch on the 6 keys to increasing the reimbursements themselves, do a deep dive into both of our services, then just wrap up by reviewing the onboarding process. So with all that being said, kind of rewinding back to the good old days, which was before 1990, if you were doing out of network at that time, you know that you could submit a claim to the insurance companies and they would pay it at 98 to 100% of the overall bill charges. Now today, the payers are utilizing a variety of different tactics, which will allow them to reimburse a provider at roughly between 20 and 50% of those charges. Now, because of our results, we've grown to a company that serviced over 2,500 providers nationwide, pretty much every type of provider that you can think of too. So from the single physician practitioner all the way up to the national health system, surgery centers, labs, behavioral health, and even the really niche provider types. So things like dialysis and air medicine. And the reason why these providers turn to us is because of our team. So we have former hospital CEOs and CFOs. We have physicians and inside and outside legal experts, many of whom have well over 15 years experience dealing specifically with these types of out-of-network claims. And our team has held senior management positions with insurance companies and vendors like Aetna, United Healthcare, MultiPlan, and Viant. So starting with our founder, Don Greenberg. Don is a physician with a Wharton MBA. He's actually been on the business side of healthcare now for over 30 years. Back in 1991, he started a company called About Health, which was the first to work on behalf of the insurance industry to actually show them ways to reduce payments to providers for out-of-network claims. And at that time, his clients were all the major payers, so Aetna, Cigna, UHC, and Blue Cross Blue Shield. Now, one of the things that Don did for the insurance companies when he was working with them is that he was the one that developed the original 9 databases, which they used to calculate what a reasonable and customary payment would actually be for an out-of-network claim. And we point that out because those databases are still being utilized by the payers to this day. Now, in 1999, he ended up selling About Health to his largest competitor at the time, which was a company called Concentra. Concentra was then purchased by Viant, and now Viant is rolled up underneath the MultiPlan umbrella. He ended up getting out of the business entirely in 2000, and then he started CollectRx 6 years later to provide the same type of expertise, but this time for healthcare providers, not for the payers. And when he built the team, he brought with him all of his senior executives and his negotiators that previously worked with them at About Health and Viant and MultiPlan. And next up is one of our key contributors and thought leader in out-of-network, John Bardos. John is a lawyer by training. He was a former litigator at K&L Gates before coming on board with CollectRx. If you're unfamiliar with that law firm, it currently is one of the nation's largest. But what's important to point out here is that during John's time there, he would work on cases that would act as cost containment measures for the insurance companies. Nowadays, though, John is a nationally recognized thought leader on out-of-network. He conducts numerous speaking engagements on a regular basis, and he's written several different articles on the subject. And then last but definitely not least is our co-founder, Sonny Bloom. Sonny's an engineer by training, also has a Harvard MBA, but really what makes him stand out is that he was the original chief operating officer for Don's first company, About Health. But unlike Don, he actually stayed on board after that merger, and he continued to help run the entire operations for Viant and Multiplan for the next 10 years. So from an operational aspect of how those companies get structured, this is the go-to guy because he literally wrote the book on this. And again, having this type of human capital behind our providers is a very good asset to have. Now, switching gears over to the tactics that the payers are currently using to reduce provider revenue, it's important to understand the size and scope of companies like Multiplan and Viant. These are not mom and pop shops by any means. In fact, they each receive well over 10 million out-of-network claims each year. And every time a new claim is received, they then use computer algorithms to determine which of two tactics would yield the lowest possible payment to a given provider. Now, one tactic they use is to reach out to negotiate a settlement in exchange for that provider agreeing not to balance bill the patient for that discounted amount. So, in other words, they're reaching out for this large discount after services have been provided and after that patient's left the facility, but before any payments taken place. And typically, they'll give the provider a very short turnaround time, and they're doing this by design. What they're working to do is to put that provider into a high pressure scenario so they then turn around and make a rush decision on that claim. And what a lot of providers don't realize is that sometimes those deadlines are real, but a lot of times they're not. What they're doing is they're really trying to put them into that high pressure scenario so they make a rush decision on that claim. Now, it's going to be important to be able to identify that difference and then take advantage of it. Meaning the more time you have to go back and forth with one of these silent PPOs, the more successful you're going to be on the outset. Now, strategy number 2 is just to simply reprice the claim down to what they consider to be a reasonable and customary payment, which is typically 50% or less of the bill charges, and then calling that reasonable and customary. If you were to reach out to the payers to ask them how they came up with these calculations, it's not something that they're going to share with you. So it'd be really important for your team to have a robust set of data and analytics on your side to be able to combat that determination. Now, a third tactic they use, which is really devious, is that they hire senior professionals who used to work for healthcare providers. And these people would know a lot about any given business office. In fact, they have databases that track every past negotiation. So when one of these out-of-network claims gets input, on their end, a screen is going to pop up with the names, titles, and phone numbers of everyone in that business office. And it's going to be so specific that it'll say things like, don't go to Mary. She only gives out 30% discounts. You need to reach back out to Bill. He works at this separate location. Here's his contact info and his hours. If you can get a hold of him, he's going to give you a 50% discount. And the reason why they're doing this is they're looking for someone within that organization to sign off on a low offer. Because they'll do then in turn is use that against you on all of your future cases, claiming that to be reasonable and customary moving forward. Now, going over the 6 keys to increasing reimbursements themselves, the first 2 of these are fairly obvious. The first one's time and persistence. Handling out-of-network claims, if you're doing it correctly, is extremely time-consuming. And it can involve multiple FTEs, writing letters, and making calls every single day. Now, this is one of 100 different tasks that the average business office does have to tackle. So we like to point out here that not only do we have the time, but we have the manpower to do this type of work on a full-time basis. Which leads right into key number 2, which is focus. So again, the average business office is getting pulled in multiple different directions, where our sole focus is on increasing the reimbursements, specifically on out-of-network claims and on the back end of the billing cycle. And that's one of the main reasons why we're so good at what we do. Now, key number 3 is a pretty big one because this does go to the core of who we are, and this would be specialized out-of-network expertise. So part of our secret sauce is the depth of our knowledge of how these out-of-network reimbursements work from the insurance company's perspective. As I mentioned earlier, our team comes from every major payer and vendor, and we do handle over $1 billion in out-of-network claims each year. So with that being said, it's important to know when it's best to call and when it's best to write a given payer. And our experienced team would know who to speak with at each of the insurance companies, and we have the ability to get in touch with senior personnel at the insurance companies, who oftentimes are the only ones with the authority to approve these higher payments. And in general, most providers don't even know that these departments exist, let alone the correct person to contact within that department. And then if you're lucky enough to get a hold of someone, it's going to be important to know what arguments to make. And the factors to consider would include who's the payer, who is the out-of-network vendor working for that payer, how do your charges compare to other similar providers in a geographic area, and then of course, what are the standard care rates that are on the marketplace these days. Now, you would also need to know when it's best to write or call a payer. what arguments to make, and then obviously how to read an EOB. And eventually, you're also going to need to know when to escalate the appeal process, either internally at the payer or externally with a state insurance commission or even the U.S. Department of Labor if necessary. Now, key number 4 is equally as important, and this is the ability to obtain data to prove that the insurance company's payments are indeed inaccurate. And we have an incredible amount of comparable data because remember, we're constantly aggregating the data and results from our 2,500 customers that we've serviced nationwide. We use the data and analytics to compare our determination of what's reasonable and customary with the insurance companies. And in many cases, because we have this data and we can use it in real time, we're able to identify holes in the payer's arguments and convince them to increase those payments right then and there on the spot. Key number 5 is understanding payer side incentives. So this is both from a financial point of view, but also from the perspective of keeping their clients happy. We understand patient noise very well, and we do use that as leverage to help our providers. And then the 6th and final key is access to healthcare reimbursement attorneys. We do have attorneys on staff as well as access to some of the best healthcare reimbursement attorneys in the country, thanks to John's experience at K&L Gates. And this slide here is just used again to emphasize that CollectRx has been built from the ground up to do that one thing and one thing only, and that's to maximize out-of-network reimbursements. Now, diving into the services, we're going to start with our negotiation, or what we call our prepayment service. Now, this one's going to be used when the insurance companies are reaching out after you provided service to a patient and after that patient's left your facility, but before a payment's been made or an EOB has been generated. And you see an example of one of these negotiation requests on the screen here. The big takeaway from this, though, is that because we can leverage our decades worth of experience actually working for insurance companies and the massive amount of data that we have, our average on these types of claims is 90 to 100% of the overall bill charges. Now, this slide here is really important just to show how important it is to effectively negotiate. And what you're looking at is one of our clients utilizing this service. Before us, they were actually averaging 80% of billed charges on these negotiation requests, which is phenomenal when you think about it, right? Because that's going to beat any type of in-network contract, and there's really no question of whether or not that beats a Medicare or Medicaid reimbursement. But from our point of view, that's really not the right comparison to make. And what we mean by that is with CollectRx handling cases totaling over 1.5 million in billed charges, our average was 94.1% of those charges, or roughly $1.4 million. So by utilizing the service and even after taking the fees into account, the client increased their out-of-network revenue by more than $135,000. And that's a significant number to drill down on because it's achieved simply by sending faxes and emails. So we like to stress to new and prospective clients that we can replicate these results for them as well. Meaning we handle all types of commercial health insurance. So auto, workers' comp, even international. The only types of claims that we don't touch are Medicare and Medicaid claims. So getting these cases in our hands is a simple process. You either fax, email, or use a secure FTP site to send over the written discount proposal, the name and the phone number of the person that reached out to you, and then the corresponding claims form. Now, when we do get a result, we're going to notify you immediately, but really more importantly, we actually follow up with the insurance company to ensure that you're paid on time and in the correct amount. And anyone who's ever had to do that follow-up process knows it's like a full-time job in its own right. So our clients really like the fact that they can outsource that function to us as well, because what they're doing in essence is they're not only increasing the overall profitability of the company, but also the productivity of the internal team. Now, service number 2 is our appeal, or what we call the post-payment service. This one's going to be used when the insurance company just simply reprices the claim down to what they consider to be, quote unquote, reasonable and customary, which is typically close to a Medicare rate or less. They send a check along with an EOB like the one that you see here. And from that insurance company's perspective, when they go through this process to them, they've completely satisfied their obligation and there's nothing more for them to do. Now, with the appeal service, we're able to get the insurance companies to increase the payment by 50 to 100%. Now, this case study here is fairly straightforward. It shows that we identified 73 cases to appeal for the client. We're successful on 45 of them, and the end result was an additional $300,000. But that's not really what makes this stand out. What makes this impressive is that when we first start with new clients, we do a full 1-year review of all of their out-of-network history to identify claims that we can overturn for additional revenue. In this example, the client had only been open for 6 months. So that means that we really only had about 4 months worth of data to really go on. And even with that very small subset of data, we still were able to capitalize for that client to the tune of over $300,000. Now, as I was just mentioning, when we first start working with new clients, we do a full 1-year review of their out-of-network history to identify opportunities to appeal. Well, the tool that we use to do it is something called the Crixus Business Intelligence Engine. Now, this is a data and analytics tool that we've developed internally that helps us maximize payments as we're going toe-to-toe with these payers. And what it does for us is it provides us with vast amounts of comparable data, because remember, we're constantly aggregating the data and results from our client base. Also, we discussed earlier how the insurance companies will keep tabs on the tendencies and trends of your office. Well, we keep tabs on the tendencies and trends of their office as well. This way we know we're always speaking to the correct person, but more importantly, we'll know the soft spots in the chain of command to kind of go after when we're making arguments. But by and far the most impressive part of Crixus is it does contain the specific written language from insurance policies across the country, which will actually define what a reasonable and customary payment could be in any given scenario. So to give you an example of that, we could be in a situation where the insurance companies want to pay Medicare plus 10%, and they're calling that reasonable and customary. But if you have access to the actual plan language, reasonable and customary could be defined as what other similar providers in the community charge. Now, to us, when we see something like that, we think charges mean charges. And again, you can imagine that this is an incredibly powerful resource to draw from when you're going to make these arguments for additional reimbursements directly with the payers. But in general, we're also using the power of Crixus to identify cases with potentially recoverable underpayments, and then we turn that into significant revenue by appealing directly to the insurance companies. Now, the review process is a simple one, and it would consist of going directly into payer portals online, basically bumping the data that's contained in the EOB stored in these payer portals up against our current database. What we'd be looking for are trends on cases where we've been similar in the past, or successful in the past, so that we can then generate a case list. We'd then share that case list with the provider, and if they wanted us to move forward, fantastic. The appeals process would start there, and that would really represent found money from that point forward. Now, not only do we deliver great results, but we do have a no-risk approach to the business relationship, meaning there's no upfront cost, there's no technology downloads required to operate either service. Both can be done by fax, email, or secure FTP site. And really, many of our best clients see us as an extension of their business office, meaning by letting us focus on these out-of-network claims, it frees up time for them to work on any in-network or any Medicare or Medicaid accounts, therefore increasing revenue and productivity from those sources as well. But the most important thing to point out here is that there are no minimum number of claims that a client needs to send in order to work with us. And because there's no long-term binding commitment, a client can also stop using us at any time without fear of a cancellation fee or termination penalty. No, that you just simply stop sending us cases. Onboarding is also fairly simple. It consists of a quick 15 to 20-minute phone call. This is just to go over the mechanics of how to get cases in our hands. We would want anyone on the provider's team that would work with us on a day-to-day basis to be on that call. And as soon as the call is over, you do get a negotiation. By all means, send it over to us. We will negotiate it into the 90th percentile. And at the same time, we'll start that Crixus analysis to identify claims that we can overturn for additional revenue. So as providers survey the landscape today, there really aren't a whole lot of opportunities to improve reimbursement rates when you think about it, right? In-network contracts are very difficult to obtain, and then once you have them, they're almost impossible to change. And I think everyone knows that Medicare and Medicaid rates are not going to be improving for the better anytime soon either. So out-of-network really does represent that last great opportunity for a provider to bring more dollars through the door and to ultimately improve the bottom line. That really is it from start to finish. I'd love to get some feedback and answer questions.
Thanks so much, Ryan. A couple of questions that we've had come in. The first, so you mentioned aggressive payer tactics. What are you seeing today that you weren't seeing before?
Excellent question. Well, we're seeing a multi-layered approach to repricing companies. I know that's kind of a lot to unpack, so just to simplify it a little bit. We're seeing it specifically from one payer where we'll have an initiation of a negotiation request, those prepayment offers from companies like MultiPlan. We'll see the allowables topping out at very low amounts, where typically we could negotiate to 90 and 100%. These would top out closer to 30 and 40%. The claim would then go back to reprocess at the payer side, have an initial payment, but then get filtered again through a second silent PPO. The good thing about this is that we are able to identify these claims and then initiate the negotiation process a second time to then push those allowables into the 90th percentile. But that would definitely be an example of something that's new this year that we haven't seen in the past.
Is there anything else that we can do to combat these additional tactics?
Well, I mean, I may sound a little bit like a broken record here, but absolutely auditing your EOBs on a regular basis and making sure that you're, maintaining visibility on them at all times Otherwise, you're going to miss those opportunities to, recapture those second and in some cases third payments here.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Ryan. That's all we have time for right now. But if we haven't gotten to your question, we'll reach out directly to you in the next couple of days and get you an answer on it. And again, thank you to Ryan for your excellent presentation, and everybody enjoy your day. And we look forward to having you join us on future webinars.
Great, thank you.